I'm Bob Daniel. I'm the Vice President of Certification for HRMA, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker and what's going to be a very interesting program today. Our speaker today is Dr. Gleb Sapersky. He's an internationally recognized thought leader known as the disaster avoidance expert. Dr. Gleb is on a mission to protect leaders from the dangerous judgment errors known as cognitive biases. He does so by using a combination of his pragmatic business experience and cutting-edge neuroscience and behavioral economics research to develop the most effective strategies for making decisions, managing risk, developing strategic plans, and avoiding business disasters. A best-selling author of several traditionally published books, Dr. Gleb is best known for his Never Go with Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters, published by Career Press. His newest book, published by Changemaker Books, is Resilience, Adapt and Plan for the New Abnormal of the COVID-19 Coronavirus Pandemic. His groundbreaking thought leadership was featured in over 550 articles and 450 interviews in prominent venues. These include Time Magazine, CBS News, Business Insider, The Chronicle of Philanthropy, CNBC, and Fast Company. Dr. Gleb's expertise comes from over 20 years of consulting, coaching, speaking, and training experience as CEO of Disaster Avoidance Experts. His clients include innovative startups, large nonprofits, and Fortune 500 companies like Aflac, Honda, Wells Fargo, the World Wildlife Fund, and Xerox. His expertise also comes from his research background as a cognitive neuroscientist and behavioral economist. He spent 15 years in higher education, including 7 years as a professor at Ohio State University, where he published dozens of peer-reviewed documents. In his free time, he makes sure to spend abundant quality time with his wife to avoid disasters at home. To help us take advantage of his expertise, I've asked him to share his research and thoughts regarding COVID-19 adaptation and planning via neuroscience and HR professionals. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Gleb.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that, Bob. Well, everyone, this is definitely a timely topic given the situation with the president catching COVID-19 and his immediate circle catching COVID-19, making the topic even more real, relevant, and timely for everyone. I'm sure a lot of the employees in the organizations where you're working on are talking about this very topic right now at the moment around the water coolers or the virtual water coolers, whatever the situation may be. And you as an HR professional need to know what they're talking about, what they're thinking about, and of course, much more broadly for your organization, how your organization can cope with COVID-19, and perhaps also thinking from a career, professional development perspective, how you can effectively cope with your career regarding COVID-19. So let's talk a little bit about this topic. Let's get into it. The first thing I want to talk about is how people reacted to COVID-19 early onward, just so we understand where we are, how we got here, because this place where we are is not a great place. The United States leads the world in deaths with COVID-19, over 210,000 people, and 8 million cases. It's a bad place. And it came from denying the really negative aspects of the pandemic from the beginning. And this happened not simply with the political world. I mean, I just brought up politics because it's just happening literally right now as we speak on October 6th. But it happened in the business world as well. So think about Elon Musk. Elon Musk, very prominent business leader, new entrepreneur, founder, head of SpaceX, head of Tesla, founder of Tesla. And a lot of people listen to him because of how popular, prominent, and powerful he is. He has a lot of followers. So what did he say about the coronavirus pandemic? So he said that the coronavirus panic is dumb. And this was when the coronavirus pandemic was taking root in the United States on March 6th. Given how many followers he has and how popular of a sentiment this was, it got 1.7 million likes on Twitter and over 340,000 retweets. Now, shortly afterward, after the declaration of COVID-19 being pandemic in the United States, national emergency, he tweeted that based on current trends, probably close to 0 new cases in the US by the end of April. That was on March 19th. And of course, as we know right now, we have way more than 0 new cases. We have 8 million cases, over 8 million cases by now. So he's clearly wrong and he made bad mistakes. Well, that's new entrepreneurs, new money. What about old money? People, experts like Goldman Sachs, right? Doesn't get more old money than that. A lot of people who don't listen to entrepreneurs like Elon Musk listen to Goldman Sachs. This is a gold standard in financial advice. And one of the things they do, fundamental thing they do, is they give advice on forecasts. They forecast GDP, US GDP growth for their clients, financial investors. So they forecast a GDP growth of US for the US in the second quarter on February 24th, as the coronavirus was quite clearly circulating in the US because it was first discovered in late January. So February 24th, they forecast 2.7% growth. That's despite the fact that there were in Italy already a number of shutdowns due to COVID-19. Now, they changed their estimate a couple of weeks later on March 15th. From 2.7% growth, it now went to a 5% decline. 5% decline, wow. 7.7% change in 3 weeks. Clearly, they screwed up their first estimate. But what happened only 5 days later on March 20th? It went from a 5% decline to a 24% decline. Again, even a bigger screw up. Over 5 days, 19 points of increase, percentage points lost. Wow. The final numbers came in at 32.9% decline. So even worse than their worst estimates. Clearly, they screwed up badly. So most people, as a result, were unprepared for COVID-19. And most companies, most organizations, most leaders, they listen to Elon Musk, they listen to Goldman Sachs, they listen to other folks like that, and so they weren't prepared. And now I want you to go to this poll that I typed out in the chat. So please go to this poll, and I want you to vote on way back in March. How well did your organization anticipate the damaging impact of the pandemic? So please go ahead and vote. I know we have 24 participants, so let's make sure we get everyone's votes in. So right now we see that 13 people voted. So please, let's make sure everybody else votes. I'll give you 10 more seconds to make your voice heard. 10 more seconds. Go to the website and make sure to vote. All right. So you should all see the results. We see that the very few people overestimated the impact. The people who got it spot on were larger, just over a quarter, but the large majority underestimated its impact. The large majority, following Elon Musk, Goldman Sachs, so many others, underestimated its impact. About 2/3 underestimated the impact, with either moderately, so half of you, or 1/8 of you seriously underestimated the impact. So your organizations, of course, not you individually. So that's an example, and that's what I tend to see in organizations all over, these sorts of underestimations and overestimations, these sense of underestimations of the reality of the pandemic. It's a serious issue, and folks greatly underestimated it. So that was the big problem. And so as a result of underestimating the threat, they were caught unprepared. Leaders were caught unprepared by the pandemic, and they made bad decisions as they were caught unprepared because all they had was their emergency business continuity plans. And that's what they turned to. But business continuity plans are actually a bad fit for the pandemic. And I tell you this as a disaster avoidance expert. I've made a lot of business continuity plans. So I can tell you that that's not what they're intended for. They're not intended, or at least the typical business continuity plan is not intended for the pandemic. That's not what they're for. They are great for emergencies. So when there's a major flood, or perhaps a blizzard, or some kind of major heat wave where you just can't go to work, that's what they're prepared for. A 1 to 2 week business interruption, fire, something like that. But that's an emergency. That's what they're prepared for. But that's not what COVID-19 is. COVID-19 is not a 1 to 2 week emergency. That it's a major disruptor. And we as individuals, as human beings, are not prepared emotionally, mentally, for these sorts of slow-moving, high-impact, and long-term disruptors. And that's why we turn to what we have, and what we have is bad. What we have is prepared for a sprint. That's what a business continuity plan typically is, not a marathon, which is what COVID-19 is. Relying on business continuity plans leads to a lot of problems. And that's probably some of the things that you've seen in your organizations. So let's talk a little bit about how we'll get out of the situation. And you've probably heard a lot about a vaccine as leading us out. Indeed, it's the only effective solution. We don't have effective treatments. It doesn't look like we'll have them in a timely manner. So really the thing that will get us out of the situation is a vaccine. Human trials are the most optimistic. If we throw all the money at it, if we cut all the red tape, which to test the safety and effectiveness of the vaccine, will take about a year, at least in the most optimistic scenario. Now, this is incredibly optimistic because previously the fastest timeline was the 4 to 5 years, and it usually takes quite a bit more. So for example, we started working on the Ebola vaccine in 2003, but only finished it in 2019. Not great. So vaccine, you have to understand that most vaccines don't make it through human trials. In fact, of vaccines that are in phase 3 trials, so the last stage, now the large majority of them don't make it even to phase 3 trials because they're not sufficiently safe and effective. But even the ones in phase 3 trials, which are the last major trials, and that's the trials in which Moderna is in, Pfizer is in, Johnson & Johnson is in, AstraZeneca was in until the serious illness that caused the suspension of the trial in the US. Maybe it'll be resumed. So those are the trials. Only 20% of vaccines make it for those trials. So the chances are, given we only have 4 candidates in these trials, the chances are that none of them will make it in terms of past probability. Hopefully, I'm very hopeful that one of them will make it, maybe 2, but there's only a 20% chance probability for each individual vaccine making it through the trials. So it's likely that the first trials won't be successful. It's just the reality of the situation. Now, what happens after we get a successful vaccine? Hopefully we'll get it sometime, right? So after we get a successful vaccine, the government, the central government, of course, has to manage the production of it, the distribution and vaccination of people. Hopefully it won't be the situation with PPE, personal protective equipment, where the federal government told all the state governments that you're on your own, do what you need to do to get PPE. And that doesn't look like it. The federal government is indeed funding production of the vaccine. But production, distribution, vaccination, that's what will have to happen. And given that the federal government has not shown much competence so far, unfortunately, in the providing personal protective equipment, testing, and it basically told states that, hey, you have to do this on your own. It has not shown a federal centralized response that's been effective in providing these resources. There's no particular reason to think it'll be very effective in vaccine distribution provision. So let's think about timelines. What kind of timelines are we talking about? We can talk about an optimistic one, a moderate one, and a pessimistic one. So an optimistic, a realistic, and a pessimistic. And I don't mean realistic, pessimistic, I mean realistic. That's the moderate one. So optimistic, let's talk about this. Let's say we look out, one of the vaccines is ready. One of the vaccines, one of the 4 vaccines is approved, even though chances are it won't be. So it'll be approved for mass production sometime by summer of 2021. Maybe we'll have emergency authorization in the spring, and then approval for mass production in summer of 2021. What happens then? Well, production, distribution, vaccination happens. And it really depends on on the vaccine that's approved. So for example, the leading candidate, well, AstraZeneca was the leading candidate. Now its trial is suspended, so we're going to the next one, Pfizer. Pfizer is the next leading candidate. And the vaccine for that, the Pfizer vaccine, you have to have 2 shots, first of all, so it's double the regular amount of vaccine work that we do. And then if we have to distribute it, it has to be stored at minus 70 degrees Celsius. And that's not something that typical medical offices or pharmacies have access to. Even many hospitals don't. It's something that research labs and major hospitals have access to. So that's going to be really tough to distribute it to everywhere it needs to be distributed. And then vaccination. Can you imagine if people have to be vaccinated in hospitals, not going to your neighborhood pharmacy? That's going to be incredibly difficult logistically. But let's say the federal government is wonderfully competent. We have a federal government level of competency that's as good as we did in, let's say, World War II, military level effort. Then it'll take 6 months at the very, very optimistic. Then most people will be vaccinated by early 2022. That's an incredibly optimistic timeline. It's very unlikely to happen. I'd say no more than 25% probability that this combination will happen, that by early 2022, most people will be vaccinated. And remember, with vaccination, you have to overcome people's fears and worries about being vaccinated. Right now, less than half of the population is ready to take a vaccine that's currently available, that's made available in the next couple of months. So you have to have a major education campaign and get people to trust the vaccine. That's another obstacle to, of course, vaccination, those 6 months. Let's talk about a moderate timeline. This is much more realistic. So moderate timeline, the vaccine will be approved for mass production by 2023. So this is a range of timelines, sometime from approval by the late 2021 to late 2025. So if it's if it's 2023, so end of 2022, beginning of 2023, that assumes that the first vaccine we have is not a safe and effective vaccine. By the way, safe and effective, by effective, I mean a vaccine that's about 90% effective. You know, if it's a vaccine that's 50% effective, it would be good to have that. I mean, I'd like to cut my chances of having COVID by 50%, but you know, the reality is it's going to be 105,000 deaths instead of the 210,000 deaths we have right now. That's not going to be great. And it's not really going to address the fears of your employees, of people with whom your company works, of COVID. So we're not talking about a 50% effective vaccine. We're talking about one of these vaccines, one of the 4 vaccines being 90% effective, 80% effective at least, but 90% effective is what we can actually want to. So if we get a 50% effective vaccine, well, that's not going to be the scenario we're talking about. It would be nice if we get a 50% effective vaccine and then we somewhat reduce the spread of COVID. But when we're really talking about getting to is a 90% effective vaccine. And so assuming one of the first vaccines is not 90% effective, we'll take the information from that on why it's not effective, how to do better, and feed it into a second wave of vaccines. And that will need to go through its own trials and so on. So that's the scenario for 2023, the second generation of vaccines that is informed by the first generation. And production, distribution, vaccination, moderate level of government competence, much better than it has shown in its early response to COVID-19, will take at least a year. So then most people will be vaccinated by 2024. And that's, again, with the second generation vaccine, will be 90% effective. This is the most likely scenario, 50%. Unfortunately, we can also get unlucky. So it can be the case that we're in a pessimistic timeline. It will be approved for mass production by 2026. That means that the second generation of vaccines won't be effective, won't get to 80–90% effectiveness. That means we'll have to go to a third generation. So taking what we learned from the second generation, maybe it'll be 50% effective, then 60% effective. And then this third generation hopefully will be 90% effective. Then production, distribution, vaccination, optimistically a year. Then most people will be vaccinated by 2027. And this is definitely possible. It's unfortunate. It's not the likeliest case, but it's possible. I'd say there's at least a 25% possibility of this. You might think this is too cynical, too negative, but remember, it took 17 years to produce a vaccine for Ebola, and that was certainly an issue. And we still don't have a vaccine for the flu that's effective. We only have a vaccine that's 50% effective for the flu. That's really too bad. So we've been working on that for over a century. We don't want to be in that situation with COVID. So this is something we have to realize is the reality of the situation. That's what we're facing. So that's what we're facing. And I have to tell you that I want you to discourage you from planning for the optimistic scenario, because so many companies, so many leaders plan for the most optimistic scenario, plan for early 2022, but it's only 25% chance probability. You want to hope for the best, but you need to plan for the worst. This is not a good idea. Hope is not a strategy. This is a great quote attributed to Vince Lombardi. And you hope for the best and plan for the worst is another great quote. So that's what I want to encourage you to do. Prepare for the moderate or the pessimistic scenario instead. So this is not easy to hear. I mean, I have to be honest, when I first started researching this, looking into this, this was in December of 2019, when I, as a disaster avoidance expert, risk management expert, when I saw this pandemic developing in the middle of China, I was wanting to research it, figure it out. It's kind of like nowhere China, right? People are ignoring it. But when I started looking at it, Wuhan, China is actually a major metropolis. It has over 11 million people. It has a very effective public health system. It produces over $22 billion of revenue per year. It's a city that's called the Chicago of China for its industrial production and a transportation hub. In fact, it has about 200 international flights a year. I'm sorry, a day, 200 international flights a day. So that carries, on an average, let's say, of 500 people on a flight, that carries about 10,000 people in and out of Wuhan every day. So of course it's going to spread. And if into around Asia and around the world as well. And if the public health system of Wuhan is going to collapse, you better believe that public health systems around the world are going to collapse without serious intervention, because it's a modern industrialized city. And so people were ignoring it. And I was just getting really depressed back in January and February as I was figuring out this information. I struggled with this. It was really painful. And I was talking about this to my clients, and I was writing articles about this. So you can see that I was writing articles about this in end of February and early March, well, written end of February, published in early March, and Business Insider, Columbus Dispatch, prominent venues like this, Inc. magazine, so on. And I was sending these to my clients. I was telling them that you really need to prepare. It's going to be much worse than you think. And they were struggling with this painful information too. So they found it difficult to accept. The thing that helps accept it, gets us to acceptance, is that it'll be much more painful in the long term if you don't accept and adapt to this major, major disruption. So now I want you to go back to the poll, take a look at the poll, and go on to the next question. Which of the various scenarios will you plan for going forward? Which of these scenarios will you plan for going forward? Please vote. All right, so we see that 14 people voted, 15 people voted. I'll give people 5 more seconds for anyone who still wants to make their voice heard. Great. So we can see that 1/5 of you are still going to be planning for the optimistic scenario. Well, okay, clearly you don't agree with me. We can talk about that in the Q&A. Around just under half of you will be planning for the moderate scenario. Good to see this, that you're planning for the moderate scenario. And I'm very relieved to see that 1/3 of you are planning for the pessimistic scenario. You gotta hope for the best, but plan for the worst. So I strongly encourage you to plan for the pessimistic scenario. Ideally, if you have the resources, at least the moderate scenario, but ideally the pessimistic scenario. Oh, great. So let's go on and talk about what's going on with the future until widespread vaccination. We'll have looser restrictions, as happen in a number of states. And so our future until widespread vaccination will have looser restrictions as happened in a number of states in Texas, Arizona, Florida, Louisiana, and so on, happening right now in Iowa, Michigan, Wisconsin, and then an increase in cases. And of course, that's going to lead to tighter restrictions, as again happened in Texas, Arizona, Florida, Louisiana, and I anticipate will be happening in the states that currently are experiencing an uptick, like Iowa, Michigan, Wisconsin, and so on. And then a decrease in cases, which happened in the states that imposed tighter restrictions. So that's what we're facing. We're facing repeating waves of these loosening, increase, tightening, decrease, and various levels of social distancing shutdowns until a vaccine is widely available. So until realistically 24, 25, 26, and I'm talking about an effective vaccine, not a 50% effective vaccine. Again, 50% effective vaccine, that's great. It'll be good. It should be approved by the FDA because it'll reduce the prevalence of COVID. It'll reduce the prevalence of COVID-19 at least a little bit, but it definitely will not address the situation the way that we want it addressed, right? So let's talk a little bit about what will happen to the world. The world will really change forever. So it will not be the same after we go through this. We'll have these waves of restrictions, these fears, these anxieties that we all experience and that we all have to deal and go through. They'll change people's habits, norms, values, desires. We'll never go back to that idyllic time of January 2020, no matter how much we want to. We need to realize that time is over. We won't go back to that. So your role as a trusted advisor, as an HR professional, you're a trusted advisor. Your role is to empower the leaders of your organizations to realize the full extent of this major disruption, which many of them unfortunately have not yet realized. Many are still way too optimistic. They're hopeful that we'll have a vaccine in a couple of months, and that means, snap, it'll be over. Not how it works. Unfortunately, that's just not how it works. And people are way too optimistic about that, and they're not preparing for the long-term future, not preparing for the reality, even if the optimistic scenario is going to go into early 2022, and that's quite unlikely. You need to really prepare for the moderate or ideally pessimistic scenario. So help them prepare for this uncomfortable reality and know that doing so will help them accomplish their leadership goals, of course. So you need to convince them and help them understand how doing so will help them accomplish their leadership goals. And that will also build trust in you as a trusted advisor to your leader. So that will rebound on you to your benefit in the organization. Now, the pandemic is a slow-moving threat, and we don't deal well as humans with slow-moving threats. Make very bad decisions about such threats, unusual, slow-moving, high-impact, because of how our brain is wired, of how we think. Our gut reaction, our intuitions, our emotions underestimate such threats. And that leads to decisions that really endanger our businesses, our organizations, whatever organization you work in. The bad advice that we get to go with our gut, trust our intuitions, they come from dangerous judgment errors. We feel like we should do something and then we do it. That's not a good idea. That's what's called cognitive biases, these dangerous judgment errors that stem from how our brain is wired. And that comes from our evolutionary background and the specific structure of our brain. So our evolutionary background, the crucial thing that you need to understand there is the fight or flight response. We are evolved not for the modern environment. The modern environment has really been around since World War II. So we're not evolved for it. We're evolved for the savanna environment. When we lived in small groups of hunter-gatherers, 15 to 150 people tribes, and we had to have a very strong fight or flight response. It was very important for hunter-gatherers because the risks they faced were immediate, intense, in the moment, like saber-toothed tigers. You might have heard of this as the saber-toothed tiger response, where you need to jump at 100 shadows in order to get away from that one saber-toothed tiger. But that's a very bad response in today's world because the risks we face are much more ambiguous, uncertain, long-term. They might come from a notification on our smartphone about an article that somebody forwarded us about a disease in the middle of nowhere, China, right? That's the kind of threats we're facing right now. And there are specifically 3 cognitive biases, 3 dangerous judgment errors that you need to be aware of and wary of that cause us to make bad decisions around the pandemic. The normalcy bias, planning fallacy, and hyperbolic discount. Now, the normalcy bias, what's that about? Well, we tend to forecast the future based on the past. In the Savannah environment, that was a safe assumption because not much changes would happen in the future. The main thing that would change is change of the seasons, spring, summer, fall, winter. So you can safely forecast the future based on the past. So we assume that everything will keep going normally like the past. And that leads us into very bad judgment errors around the modern world because we have so much more disruptors, so many more disruptors in the modern world. Disruptors like the technology. So the smartphone has been around for the last 15 years in a major way and has really changed our lives. And that's a major disruptor. So human-caused technology disruptors. Then, of course, fiscal disruptors like the 2008-2009 fiscal crisis, major disruptor to our lives. And biology combined with human actions like the COVID-19 pandemic, major disruptor. And we underestimate the likelihood and the impact of these disruptors. Next is the planning fallacy. The planning fallacy refers to the fact that we intuitively believe that the future will go according to the plans that we make. So you might have heard that failing to plan is planning to fail. And that's a phrase that's unfortunately misleading because it leads people to assume that once they make a plan, they're safe, it's great, the future will go according to this plan. A much better phrase that I teach my clients is failing to plan for problems is planning to fail. Failing to plan for problems is planning to fail because we have many more problems and risks than we anticipate. So we don't prepare nearly enough for problems and risks, and we underestimate the resources that are needed to address them of time, money, social capital, information, all of these sorts of resources. Finally, hyperbolic discounting. Hyperbolic discounting is very important to understand that in the Savannah environment, we needed to live for the moment. We were very in the moment oriented because we couldn't save resources for the future very effectively. If you killed a mammoth, you couldn't freeze the meat. You needed to stuff your stomach right there, eat as much as possible before trying it. And in the modern environment, of course, we put it in the fridge, but not like we're killing mammoths in the fridge, but we can put our money, our resources in the bank. We can invest in our professional development and our careers, not really going to help you in the Savannah environment, where you're going to become a better ex-chipper or something, and not really going to help you there. So you can invest into your organizations, make strategic plans, make long-term investments. Unfortunately, we still perceive the short term as being more important than the long term. So we greatly underestimate the importance of the long term, of that moderate plan, of that pessimistic plan, of what's going to happen in 24, what's going to happen in 27. So we need to understand that that's our intuition to prioritize the short term over the long term, and we underestimate the long-term outcomes and impacts of our behaviors. So now I want you to go to the poll again, and we will vote on another one. Which of the cognitive biases that I described is most prevalent in your organization? So please go ahead and vote. Normalcy bias, planning fallacy, or hyperbolic discounting. Please go ahead and vote. Okay, so we have 13 out of 15. Let's make sure we get those last couple of people. Let's take around 5 more seconds. All right. So you'll see that of these biases, we see that overwhelmingly the planning fallacy is the biggest one. So not pivoting your plans, not shifting your plans, not gathering enough resources. And then the normalcy bias is the next most dangerous one. And after that, following hyperbolic discounting. So it's good for you to know which one is the most dangerous for your organization, because then that's what you need to bring to your leaders and tell them that, hey, this is what we're dealing with. Most of you should talk about the planning fallacy as the first one. And then the ones who vote for normalcy bias should talk about that. And those who vote for hyperbolic discounting should talk about that. All right, let's talk about how can businesses and other organizations prepare for the reality of COVID-19. How do you adapt to this new abnormal and the post-pandemic recovery? you need to make a fundamental change to your business model, your organizational model. Really focus on virtual interactions much, much more than seems intuitive to you. Make a commitment to virtual teams, to virtual offerings. I strongly encourage you to end office space lease. So strongly encourage you to end office space lease, whatever office space lease you have available, or at least greatly downsize it. One of the things that my clients have found is that if they can't end it, they can downsize it to maybe about something like 90% of their current office space. So I'm sorry, downsize 90% and have 10% of their office space lease remaining. So that's going to be useful for them for, if they need someone to get checks in, some information that they need to get in hand, that's the kind of thing that they have one or two people left in the office. So that's what I will encourage you to think about. And for ending office space lease, let's talk about what you need to do. So, and virtual interactions in general, let's talk about what you need to do to make sure that you have healthy virtual interactions. And of course, as HR professionals, you're going to focus first of all, on what's internally. So internal organizational transformations. And there are going to be 6 areas that you want to be thinking about in terms of pandemic-related transformations with a lot more virtual work. That's what's you need to focus on. So first of all, internal controls, of course. Financial security, really important. First and foremost, the FBI is reporting a lot more hacking, a lot more problems with internal and especially external issues with financial security, where people are not transitioning successfully because their business continuity plans is not adapted for a long-term virtual workforce. So that's a really big problem. And it's not adapted for cybersecurity vulnerabilities. Those hacking, external hacking, so much more going on. I had a situation where for a company for which I was doing a strategic pivot, there was a C-suite level executive, an older gentleman, who, when he was frustrated about not being able to access his virtual office computer at home, and he turned off his firewall. That's not great. That's really bad cybersecurity practice, but he wasn't in his office, he was frustrated. So you need to give training to your employees on cybersecurity at home, and you need to help them harden their cybersecurity protocols, both on their hardware and their software. Adapt your existing compliance practices. There's a lot more, for example, cyberbullying going on right now. A lot of folks are not paying enough attention to it, that this is not an issue. So you want to focus on cyberbullying, cybersexual harassment, a lot of other related issues. To the extent that you do have in-office interactions, some of my clients do things like, hey, getting a shared office space, that sort of thing, meeting in open areas whenever possible, to have those activities, and you want to comply with CDC guidelines. And of course, revise internal measurements of effectiveness and efficiency. So for example, a lot more people are having a disrupted workday because they need to take care of their kids who are at home or something like that. So you need to change your internal measurements of effectiveness and efficiency to make them much more project-based instead of task-based, instead of time-based. And there are lots more things to talk about. We can talk about it in the Q&A. Motivation engagement. This is something serious to think about. Even before the pandemic, only 34% of all employees were fully engaged. That means that they were creative, innovative, problem solving. Around 50% were just punching the clock, doing the bare minimum that they can to get by. And then about 15% were actively hostile, bad-mouthing the organization to others and so on, looking to leave. Working from home makes this much more a problem to engage people because we don't have our internal needs fulfilled. A lot of our internal needs, our sense of meaning, purpose, fulfillment, was from the workplace and being close to each other, being near each other, being part of our tribe. This is where tribalism really kicks in from that savannah environment, that we got our needs fulfilled from being around other employees and we lack motivation from that. So you need to address this issue. There's also the stress of adjusting your household, your life, your personal well-being, mental well-being to the pandemic, and that's a big problem. You need to provide support and guidance to your employees in these areas. Effective communication. This is a matter of professional development. A lot of people don't know how to communicate effectively virtually, especially if they have to quickly transition to in-person. They have to take care of a number of things. They didn't get professional development in this area. Now, written communication, we transition to written communication, right? Use Trello, Microsoft Teams, Google Workspace, Slack, all of those sorts of things. They're written, and they don't have all of those emotional cues that are carried by in-person interaction, whether body language, expressions of surprise, pleasure, concern, all of these sorts of things that you don't get when you actually are interacting only textually. It's essential to train employees. This is a professional development issue on virtual team communication. And a related issue, but different one, is resolving conflicts. In face-to-face interactions, you can notice conflicts much more easily. You can notice them, resolve them, you can notice emotional cues. In a virtual team, it's much more hard to notice them. And then, of course, because of our communication issues, it's much more difficult to address them. So it's really important to offer training in this area as well. Cultivating trust. This is something that happens naturally in the office. It's easy to build relationships. You talk about the water cooler, what your kids are doing, what happened in your church or other value-based groups that you went to, what happened in various vacation activities that you went, your clubs, everything that's going on in your life. So you build those relationships. But in virtual settings, it doesn't happen naturally. You need to provide a venue for this. This is not a matter of training. This is a virtual venue that you need to provide for this. And then accountability. So accountability needs to be created. In the office environment, it's natural for a supervisor to go around, see what's going on, check in with the team members, hold them accountable. But this is not possible in a virtual environment, of course. So you need to create new structures for accountability. And in the office environment, it's also easy for peers to hold each other accountable. You can pop into Mary's office and say, hey, Mary, where's that report you promised me? Much harder for Mary to ignore you when you're in her office door than when you send her a Slack message. So it needs to be up the chain of command accountability and peer-to-peer accountability. And then you want to be thinking about your external business model. HR professionals are less involved with this, but you also want to be bringing this information to your leaders and help them understand that these are areas that they should be looking at. And to the extent that you do have an external role, you want to be thinking about this. So service delivery, as much as possible, transition to virtual or socially distant service. I've done a lot of work with professional organizations, let's say lawyers, accountants, who really are scared of transitioning to virtual because they feel like the trust they had with their clients is not going to be there that they had one-on-one. Well, there's ways of professional development to cultivate trust, and you can improve your ability to do so if you're creative and if you do professional development in this area. For some businesses, I recommend that they close. Restaurants, not a good investment right now, not a good business to be in. A lot of live entertainment venues, not a good place to be in, will not survive the pandemic well. So professionally, you might want to be thinking about your career if you're in one of those areas. As an HR professional, you can choose to go to another area. So relationships, you want to learn, this is a professional development area, how to establish new relationships and cultivate existing ones virtually with your external stakeholders. So external stakeholders, clients, service providers, political leaders who right now are providing a lot of money for organizations, prospects, investors, suppliers. This is a professional development matter. Manage disruptions. So think about right now, you're checking out this webinar, you're going to be much more informed about what's going on for the future. But your external stakeholders, a lot of them will not be. So you want to be thinking about how you can protect yourself from their failures, from their disruptions. Then shifting norms. What kind of norms will change in the pandemic? We talked about how a lot of things will shift over the next several years as we go through various stages of the pandemic. The worst is by far ahead of us. We're at 210 deaths by now. Various models are predicting anywhere from 300,000 to something like 500,000 deaths by the end of the year, with 400,000 as a midpoint. I really hope it doesn't get there. That would be terrible. I mean, but even at the lower bounds, 300,000 would be really bad. So after several years of restrictions and loosenings, and that's only this year, next year, so on, these deaths, these loosenings, these restrictions, these shutdowns will have very different norms, values, desires. You want to anticipate what these will be and get ahead of these shifts. And you want to help your leaders do so of your companies. Then think about the unknown unknowns. Now, people might have talked about the pandemic as an unknown unknown, but really it was a predictable disaster. It's something that a lot of smart people like Bill Gates and many others were talking about as a serious possibility. So you want to be scanning your environment for such predictable disasters. And there are major ones coming up down the chain. So for example, there can be the potential of serious civil disruptions associated with elections. And you want to be preparing your business, your organization, for potential disruptions associated with the election and uncertainty and stability, what's going on, if the election count is going to be stretching on for much longer than previous election counts, we won't know who's the president, we won't know their policies. That'll create a serious obstacle for many businesses, nonprofits. You want to protect yourself against these. Of course, not everything can be predicted. You can't predict a major solar flare, let's say. So you want to maintain a cash cushion for some protection. Finally, outcompeting your competition. This is something that your leaders will be really happy about. If you take the steps that I advised, you will be in a much better position than a lot of your competitors who'll be stumbling during the pandemic, who'll be failing to adapt. So this is an opportunity for you to get ahead of them. Think about how you can seize market share and how you can hire away good employees as you get ahead of your competitors. All right, so now we'll go on to the next poll. Please go and vote. How well has your organization transformed its organizational model, internal and external, to adapt to the pandemic? So please go ahead, vote. %60 of you voted. Come on, folks. Can do better than this. I'm going to give you 10 more seconds to make your voice heard. Come on, those two folks. 14 out of 16. All right. So taking a look at the results, we see that a lot of you are doing great. So just over 40% of you are doing great. Very glad to hear it. That's good that you transformed your organizational model. Then, but of course, that means that the majority of you, so over 55%, need some improvements. So that's good to hear that you understand the improvements that you need. So think about all that I've presented and where those improvements will come about. All right. The final thing I wanted to share with you was how to make a strategic plan to plan for the long-term impact of the pandemic and the post-pandemic recovery, of course. Think about these 6 steps. These are the 6 steps that you need to do for your effective strategic planning. So first, look at the possible futures. The possible futures that you're dealing with, think about these possible futures. What's going to be happening in these possible futures? So look at these possible futures. That's the first step. Plan for a variety of them, variety of these possible futures, depending on your context, what's going on in your organization. The baseline, of course, is to use what we talked about earlier, the optimistic, the moderate, and the pessimistic scenarios. And then you want to invest your resources accordingly. So think about these baselines, optimistic, moderate, and pessimistic, and then on top of them, build up whatever is happening with your organizations as you look at the possible futures. Then think about 5 years out. What's going to happen in each of these possible futures? So what would your business look like, your organization look like in 5 years in each of these scenarios? The optimistic one, the moderate one, and the pessimistic one. Next, think about the problems. What kind of problems will you face in each of these scenarios? And what ways can you address them in advance? So if you're a manufacturing company, then you want to be thinking about your supply lines. There will be a lot of more disruptions than you anticipate if it's going to be a moderate timeline or a pessimistic timeline, which is the very 75% of the scenarios of the futures in which we live. Think about ways of addressing them in advance, perhaps localizing your supply chains. And if you're thinking about hiring, maybe you can do a lot more virtual workforce and virtual hiring. So you can hire not in major hubs that are going to be more expensive to hire in, but you can hire in the rural areas and maybe all around the United States, which is going to be much cheaper than what a lot of my clients are doing. Make a plan to resolve these problems if they do occur. Think about the opportunities. What kind of opportunities can you face in each of these scenarios? And what ways can you bring them about? So a number of my clients, for example, they are changing their marketing and their selling pitches. They're talking about how they're pandemic proof and they're having their salespeople do direct calling to their closers, do direct calling to some of their prospects who are working with competitors and telling them, hey, Mrs. Prospect or Mr. Prospect, you're currently working with my competitor, and that's great, but here are the steps we took A through F to become pandemic proof. So if something happens with my competitor, if the pandemic proves longer than expected, please give us a call. And of course, they're going to be getting some calls. Make a plan to seize these opportunities if they do occur. Think about resources. What resources will you need in each of these scenarios? In each of the scenarios, what kind of time, money, information, strategic capital, so revision, strategic pivot, planning do you need? And make a plan to reserve sufficient resources for not for the optimistic scenario, ideally the pessimistic scenario, if you need to, the moderate scenario. Don't plan for the optimistic one. Finally, think about the information. What information will show you which of these scenarios you're in? The fact that the AstraZeneca trial got suspended definitely doesn't bode well for the other vaccines being particularly getting to that 90% effectiveness at appropriate level of safety. You want to monitor this information closely. For example, the Bill Gates Foundation is spending billions and billions of dollars on getting to a vaccine, supporting a variety of vaccines in which it's not invested financially, not getting any money from them. So think about this information. Bill Gates is a good source, plenty of other sources that are neutral and objective. Adjust your plans accordingly, and then execute, execute, execute. All right, we'll do our last voting now. So please vote on how well suited is your strategic plan to the long-term consequences of the pandemic. So think about your existing strategic plan. How well suited is it to the long-term consequences of the pandemic? Please go ahead and vote. Long-term consequences of the pandemic. 67% of the people voted. Let's get a few more. Let's got those 5 out of 15 people who didn't vote yet. Come on, make your voices heard. Give you 10 more seconds. Okay, so take a look at the results. So you'll see that just over a third of you say it's very well adapted. Great, so you don't need to make any changes. That's wonderful. But of course, just under 2/3 of you need some revisions, either moderate tweaks or some serious revisions. Just under half of you need some moderate tweaks. So it's great that you realize that. Think about the scenarios, where you'll make those moderate tweaks. And a number of you, just under 20%, need serious revisions. That's something for you to really seriously sit down right now and be thinking about where you need to revise your strategic plans, because they're really not good enough, and you want to be thinking about how to make those strategic plans for your success. All right, everyone, so that's what I wanted to share. And then I want to let you know that you will be getting some resources from me. So watch for an email from me. There'll be a free coaching session opportunity and 2 chapters from my new book, Resilience, Adapt and Plan for the New Abnormal of the COVID-19 Coronavirus Pandemic, as resources. All right, everyone, I hope you've enjoyed this presentation, and I'll be happy to take any questions at this stage. You can unmute yourself, or you can put your questions in chat. I will be glad to answer them. Oh, you're very welcome, Chris and CJ. I'm glad that you enjoyed the presentation. I'll be sending a recording of the session. So I have a recording of the session. I'll be happy to send that. So Jonathan asks, where do you think we'll be in 5 years based on the current trajectory? That I gave the scenarios. The most likely scenario is the moderate scenario. So the moderate scenario involves vaccine widely available by 2024. So beginning of 2024, that means that in 5 years from now, we'll be around 3.5 years from, well, just less than 3.5 years from now of the pandemic, and then 1.5 years of recovery. So that's where I think it will be, that the most likely scenario, the 50% scenario, is that scenario where it'll be 3.5 more years until we get an effective 90% vaccine, 90% effective vaccine. And by that time, in 5 years, so you need to plan for about 3.5 years of still dealing with the pandemic in a variety of forms, shapes, and sizes. And then 1.5 years of recovery. So that's why it's kind of the post-pandemic recovery will be around 1.5 years in that 5-year timeline. So that's kind of, I myself am not planning for that. I'm planning for the pessimistic scenario. So I'm planning for 5 years being still with the pandemic, and then another year or so to get to 2027, because that's, I want to hope for the best, but I plan for the worst, because that's how you make yourself safe. So travel and hospitality industries will not look good. Those are really bad industries to be in, unfortunately. People will not be traveling. I mean, even if it's hopefully one of the few vaccines, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, if it's restarted, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, will be 50-60% effective. That will not address fears. I mean, if you're 50% less likely to get COVID, that doesn't mean you're going to be going out to travel. It doesn't mean you're going to be go out to indoor dining. A lot of restaurants are not going to be viable. I mean, even in states that don't have restrictions right now, a lot of restaurants are just closing because they're not seeing their customer base. They're seeing, they're seeing only 50-60% of what they had before. And that's not going to be great. 50-60% effective vaccine will not address that. So traveling and hospitality, I think they'll recover somewhat as we get that halfway effective vaccine, but I think won't really recover until we get that 80-90% effective vaccine, ideally the 90% effective vaccine. I personally will not travel except for super emergencies, like if my parents get seriously ill and I live in Columbus, Ohio, they live in New York City, I'm not traveling by airplane until I have a 90% effective vaccine. So just letting you know that. And a lot of people are in my shoes. So, and I don't have any fundamental underlying conditions, but as someone who, their 40s, that's too much of a chance risk to take. So that's an example. And there are many, many people who are like me. And of course, many people who are much older than me in their variety of ages who will definitely not be taking that risk. They will not look good. I think that they will not recover. They'll be hammered. So those aren't good industries to be in. These are not good news. Yes, I agree, CJ, go Bucks. So yeah, this is not good news, and I understand that, and it's unpleasant, and it is what it is. I give it straight. Other questions? Again, unmute yourself or chat. I'd be happy to take questions. I'm gonna wait for 5 more seconds in case the folks are thinking about it. So type or chat, unmute or chat. All right, looks like no more questions. Well, everyone, thank you very much. This has been great. I really enjoyed you being here, and I hope you've gotten the kind of information that you were looking for from this presentation. You're welcome, Carrie. You're welcome, Jonathan.